This was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. But instead, racism walked in. Subscribe for real stories that matter. The music stopped mid-note, as if the room itself had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. That was the moment everyone would remember later, the moment before the wedding turned into something else entirely. Jamal and Tiana had spent months planning this day, choosing soft gold linens, white roses, and a string quartet that played the song they first danced to in their small Brooklyn apartment. They stood near the center of the venue, hands intertwined, smiles still warm from exchanging vows, when the heavy sound of boots echoed against the marble floor. 2 uniformed police officers entered, faces tight, eyes scanning the room not with concern, but with judgment. The joy that had filled the hall only seconds earlier thinned into confusion, then unease. No one yet understood why the police were here, but Jamal felt it in his chest before a word was spoken. He had felt it before, that familiar tightening, the warning his body learned after years of being watched, questioned, and doubted for simply existing as a black man. One officer pointed directly at Jamal, ignoring the fact that he was clearly the groom, ignoring the flowers pinned to his tailored suit, ignoring the 100 witnesses dressed for celebration. "You two need to step outside," the officer said, his voice loud enough to slice through the stunned silence. Tiana's smile vanished instantly. She looked around, searching faces for answers, for logic, for someone to laugh and say this was a mistake. Jamal calmly asked why, his tone controlled, respectful, the way he had learned to speak to authority just to survive. The officer's jaw tightened. "We've had a complaint," he said, offering no details. The second officer stepped closer, his hand hovering near his belt, not openly threatening, but close enough to remind everyone who held the power. Whispers spread through the guests like a sudden cold wind. This was a private wedding, a reserved venue, a carefully approved guest list. There was no disturbance, no argument, no reason. Yet the officer's eyes stayed locked on Jamal and Tiana with a suspicion that felt automatic, practiced. Tiana finally spoke, her voice shaking but firm. "This is our wedding," she said. "You can't do this." The officer let out a short, dismissive laugh, a sound that didn't belong in a room filled with love. "Ma'am, don't make this difficult," he replied. The words carried weight, the kind Jamal recognized instantly. Make it difficult, and things could get worse. Jamal felt anger rise, sharp and dangerous, but he swallowed it. He thought of his father's voice, teaching him how to stay alive in moments like this. Stay calm. Don't argue. Don't move too fast. But standing there in front of his family, his friends, his bride in her white gown, the humiliation burned deeper than ever before. The officer gestured toward the exit. "Now." When Jamal hesitated for just a second, the officer grabbed his arm. Gasps erupted across the room. Tiana cried out and moved toward him, only to be blocked by the second officer. In that instant, it stopped being confusion. It became force. It became racism, undeniable and public. As the officers began dragging them toward the doors, their grip tightened, their movements rougher, as if to make an example of them. The message was clear: you do not belong here. Jamal's polished shoes scraped against the floor. Tiana's veil slipped loose, her bouquet crashing to the ground, white petals scattering like the pieces of a dream breaking apart. Guests stood frozen, torn between shock and fear. Some had never seen racism this openly displayed. Others recognized it immediately because they had lived it themselves. A wedding, a symbol of love and unity, was being torn apart by prejudice wearing a badge. The glass doors swung open, sunlight pouring in as if mocking the darkness of the moment. Jamal turned back one last time, locking eyes with the guests. He saw disbelief, anger, tears, and something else beginning to rise beneath it all. Resolve. This was no longer just about Jamal and Tiana. This was about every person in that room who had just witnessed an injustice unfold in real time. As the doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off the music and the celebration, a heavy silence settled over the venue. It was the kind of silence that comes right before people decide whether to stay quiet or finally stand up. And in that silence, the first spark of resistance was born. The crowd inside the hall did not stay silent for long. Murmurs turned into outraged shouts as guests began to challenge the officer's authority. "This is ridiculous," shouted one of Tiana's cousins, stepping forward, hands raised in disbelief. "They're getting married. They haven't done anything wrong." Another guest, a close friend who had flown in from Chicago, grabbed their phone and began recording, capturing every moment of the injustice for the world to see. Jamal and Tiana, forced into the sunlight of the foyer, could feel the heat of dozens of eyes burning on the officers. Yet the officers seemed impervious, as if their training had erased the ability to feel shame, the kind of brazen confidence that only comes from being certain of impunity. Jamal kept his voice calm, steady, and full of dignity despite the adrenaline pounding in his chest. "Please," he said, "we're on our wedding day. Let us go back inside. There's no cause for this." The taller officer, his face tight and unmoving, leaned slightly forward, the shadow of a sneer appearing on his lips. "You need to leave now. End of discussion." It was not just a statement. It was a warning, one weighted with centuries of discrimination distilled into a few chilling words. Tiana's hands trembled as she clutched Jamal's arm, but her voice didn't waver. "This is harassment," she said firmly, her words slicing through the tension. "We are paying customers of this venue. Our friends and family are inside. You have no right to remove us." The second officer's eyes flicked toward her, and for a moment, Jamal saw that old, familiar spark of contempt, the kind that said, "Your voice does not matter here." But before the officers could escalate further, a group of guests surged forward, forming a human shield of love and defiance. "You cannot do this," shouted one of the groomsmen, standing chest to chest with an officer who tried to step closer. Other guests joined, demanding to speak with the venue manager and recording everything. The officers hesitated for the first time, as if the sudden resistance was unexpected. The message was clear. These people were not going to allow injustice to happen in silence. Inside the venue, confusion and anger were building. The string quartet had stopped playing, instruments lowering mid-note, and whispers raced through the hall like wildfire. "Why are the police here?" someone asked, voice trembling. The wedding coordinator, pale and nervous, tried to intervene, explaining that the couple had a fully booked, private reservation, and that no complaints had been filed against them. But the officers waved her off, as if her presence was meaningless. Jamal felt his heart pound, his body on edge, but he kept moving with Tiana, step by step, knowing that losing composure here could escalate things dangerously. Yet every step outside reminded them of the humiliation they were facing, and the sheer audacity of being treated as criminals in the middle of what should have been the happiest day of their lives. The air outside was colder than the warm, scented hall they had left behind. Jamal and Tiana stood facing the officers, guests now forming a semicircle around them, many recording, some yelling, a few stepping forward to block the officers' attempts to escalate. Jamal felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders, the invisible chains of prejudice that seemed to exist everywhere he went. And yet, in that moment, he also felt something else, solidarity. The guests, strangers and family alike, were no longer just witnesses. They were allies. They were bearing witness to injustice and refusing to allow it to continue. Tiana leaned close, whispering that she could see the courage in their friend's eyes, that maybe, just maybe, this day would not end in despair. The tension stretched, thick and suffocating, until finally, the taller officer straightened, jaw tight, and spoke again. "If you do not leave voluntarily, we will take further action." Jamal's eyes met Tiana's. No words were needed. The moment demanded courage, restraint, and strategic thinking. The couple knew that any misstep could be used against them. Yet, the crowd's energy pulsed behind them, a protective force born of outrage and love. Cameras recorded every grimace, every attempt at intimidation. And in that storm of tension, the first cracks in the officers' facade began to show. They were no longer the unquestionable authority figures in a room of passive witnesses. They were facing a crowd that demanded accountability, and the power dynamic was beginning to shift, ever so slightly, but enough to change the course of the day forever. The officers, realizing the crowd was not backing down, shifted uneasily. One of them barked orders again, attempting to assert authority, but his words were drowned by the rising chorus of voices from the guests. "Step back," yelled a bridesmaid, standing firm between the officer and Tiana. "You have no right to harass them." The wedding hall now looked like a battleground of civility versus intimidation. Cameras flashed, phones recorded, and each new voice calling out for justice strengthened Jamal and Tiana's resolve. Jamal felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins, not the usual fear, but a controlled, almost electrifying sense of empowerment. He looked around at the faces of his friends, relatives, and even strangers who had quietly witnessed the injustice. In that moment, they all became part of something bigger than a wedding day, a stand against the blatant prejudice manifesting right before their eyes. The taller officer's confident facade began to falter. He had clearly not anticipated public resistance this strong. Tiana, clutching her veil and bouquet now wrinkled and partially torn from the struggle, stepped forward. "This is our wedding," she shouted, her voice echoing across the foyer. "We have done nothing wrong. You will not humiliate us in front of our family and friends." Her words resonated through the crowd, igniting a ripple of chants and cries of support. A young guest, barely in his 20s, stepped right up and confronted the second officer. "This is harassment. If you continue, we will report this. We are recording everything." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the shift in power. What began as a private act of intimidation was now public, documented, and backed by a room full of witnesses unwilling to be silent. One of the officers attempted to grab Jamal's arm again, this time with more aggression. But before he could, a large guest, one of Jamal's uncles, placed a firm hand on his shoulder, stopping him mid-step. "Hands off him," the uncle shouted, his voice strong, commanding, and without hesitation. The officer froze, clearly surprised by this resistance. Other guests stepped closer, forming a protective barrier around Jamal and Tiana. Phones raised, voices raised, and the determination in the room was palpable. For the first time, the couple felt less like victims and more like participants in a collective refusal to tolerate injustice. The air was electric with tension, every second stretching longer as the confrontation continued. Meanwhile, the wedding coordinator, still inside, had contacted the venue's management and explained the entire situation, her voice shaking but urgent. Within minutes, the venue manager appeared, standing alongside Jamal and Tiana, insisting the officers leave immediately. "This is a private event," he stated firmly, "and these two are our guests. You have no authority to remove them." The officers hesitated, muttering under their breath, caught off guard by the combined presence of the manager, the crowd, and the relentless cameras documenting everything. The power dynamic had clearly shifted. Their usual tactics of intimidation were failing under scrutiny, amplified by the collective insistence on justice. Jamal and Tiana, though still shaken, regained a sense of control. They slowly stepped back toward the entrance of the hall, flanked by friends and family. The officers, realizing their attempt to humiliate the couple had been thwarted, reluctantly allowed them passage, though their faces betrayed frustration and barely concealed anger. The guests cheered quietly, some wiping tears, others shaking their heads in disbelief at what had just transpired. Jamal felt a mixture of relief and lingering anger. This day had nearly been ruined, but the courage of the guests had transformed a moment of humiliation into one of resilience and defiance. The officers finally backed off completely, muttering to each other as they left the scene, while Jamal and Tiana returned to the hall. The music hesitated for a moment, then resumed softly, as if acknowledging that while injustice had intruded, love and solidarity had not been defeated. Guests slowly settled back, some holding cameras high to record the couple's triumphant return. The petals that had been scattered lay on the ground like fragments of the ordeal, a reminder that even amid celebration, prejudice could attempt to intrude. But this time it had been confronted head-on, and justice, even in its small, immediate form, had begun to take shape. By the time Jamal and Tiana reached the center of the hall, they were met with applause, cheers, and tears from their guests. Each person who had stood up for them had reinforced the reality that love and unity could prevail, even when authority and racism tried to assert themselves. It was more than a victory for the couple. It was a message to anyone who would dare interfere in the happiness of Black lives that there would be resistance, accountability, and witnesses ready to act. And in that charged, victorious moment, Jamal and Tiana understood that this wedding had become something far bigger than they had ever imagined, a symbol of defiance, solidarity, and unyielding courage. Within hours, the footage from the wedding began circulating online. Videos recorded by guests showed the officers' aggressive behavior, the intimidation, and the stunned reactions of friends and family. Jamal and Tiana watched in disbelief as strangers across the country expressed outrage, offering messages of support and solidarity. News outlets quickly picked up the story, broadcasting clips of the incident on television, in online news articles, and across social media platforms. The hashtag Justice for Jamal and Tiana began trending within the first day, and public commentary poured in, condemning the blatant racism displayed by the officers. Comments ranged from empathetic stories of similar experiences to calls for accountability, shining a light on systemic patterns of harassment faced by Black couples in the United States. What had been intended as a private act of humiliation was now public evidence of prejudice, amplified by the immediacy and reach of modern media. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, their actions scrutinized under intense public pressure. The city's police department released a carefully worded statement, insisting that the matter was being reviewed, but the public response made it clear that words alone would not suffice. Jamal and Tiana, initially exhausted and overwhelmed by the ordeal, now realized that their personal pain had become a symbol for many who had experienced similar treatment but had no platform to speak out. Their lawyer emphasized that the evidence, videos, photographs, eyewitness statements, was undeniable, a clear case of unlawful harassment and racially motivated discrimination. The couple began receiving inquiries from civil rights organizations, activists, and even attorneys eager to support their case. The situation had escalated from a wedding disruption to a national conversation about race, power, and accountability in public spaces. Friends and family rallied around the couple, offering emotional support and helping them navigate the legal process. Tiana spent hours reading through comments of solidarity, messages from other Black couples, and articles highlighting similar cases. "People are seeing this," she told Jamal one night, her voice choked but determined. "They're seeing what we faced. They're not letting this go unnoticed." Jamal nodded, overwhelmed by both the validation and the lingering anger at the injustice. The couple realized that while the officers had tried to assert dominance in a private, personal space, they had underestimated the collective will of those who would not stay silent. The support they received bolstered their courage and strengthened their resolve to seek justice, not just for themselves, but for anyone who might face similar harassment in the future. Meanwhile, the venue faced intense scrutiny as well. Local authorities investigated the chain of events that allowed such harassment to occur on the premises, and management pledged to review policies to prevent such discrimination in the future. The story became a cautionary tale for other venues, highlighting the need for clear protocols and staff training on how to protect clients against racial harassment. Lawyers for Jamal and Tiana prepared legal filings for civil action, citing not only the humiliation and emotional distress suffered by the couple, but also the public violation of their civil rights. Each piece of evidence, from the videos to the testimony of guests, was meticulously cataloged, forming a clear narrative that exposed the officers' conduct as both reckless and racially motivated. As the case moved forward, public attention remained unwavering. Social media campaigns, petitions, and interviews with the couple helped maintain visibility, pressuring city officials to respond. News programs ran in-depth analyses, comparing the incident to broader issues of systemic racism within law enforcement. Jamal and Tiana became reluctant but resolute public figures in their own story, speaking with calm authority about what had occurred and what it revealed about bias in policing. They highlighted not only their personal experience, but the wider implications for marginalized communities, turning their ordeal into a platform for advocacy and education. The officers' defense wavered under scrutiny. Legal experts noted the overwhelming evidence against them: clear video footage, consistent eyewitness accounts, and a lack of credible explanation for their behavior. Public statements from civil rights organizations framed the officers' actions as emblematic of a larger pattern of harassment faced by Black Americans in everyday spaces. The pressure from both legal and societal fronts made it increasingly clear that any attempt to downplay the incident would fail. Jamal and Tiana, supported by their legal team and a determined network of allies, began to see a path forward, one that would not only vindicate them, but also hold the officers accountable in a tangible, meaningful way. Ultimately, paragraph 4 establishes that the incident has escalated far beyond the wedding, setting the stage for formal legal action, widespread media attention, and growing public pressure, all pointing toward the $1.5 million outcome mentioned in the title. Weeks later, the couple found themselves sitting in a quiet conference room, surrounded by lawyers, evidence files, and the weight of what was to come. Jamal and Tiana had never imagined that a wedding disruption would lead them into a legal battlefield. But the reality was undeniable. The officers' actions, captured in countless videos and eyewitness testimonies, had set the stage for a civil rights lawsuit that would demand accountability on multiple levels. The law firm representing the couple meticulously laid out the case: racial harassment, violation of civil liberties, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and abuse of authority. Each claim was backed by hours of footage showing the officers' aggression, the guests' attempts to intervene, and the couple's visible humiliation. Jamal felt a mix of determination and exhaustion. This was more than money or legal formalities. It was a chance to make sure no other couple would endure what they had endured. Tiana, sitting beside him, reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "We have to see this through," she whispered, "for us, for everyone who might face this next." The words hung in the room like a promise, heavy yet resolute. The courtroom itself became a stage for the broader conversation about systemic racism and authority. As Jamal and Tiana testified, recounting the events of their wedding day, their voices trembled at first, but grew stronger with every word. "We were humiliated," Tiana said, pausing as she tried to steady herself. "Our friends and family watched as we were treated like criminals for simply being Black." The judge listened attentively, occasionally glancing at the officers seated across the room, whose expressions were unreadable but undeniably tense. Lawyers for the city attempted to downplay the officers' behavior, suggesting procedural misunderstandings and miscommunications, but the overwhelming evidence, clear video footage, consistent eyewitness accounts, and a meticulously documented timeline, left little room for ambiguity. Public sentiment, still active online and in media coverage, amplified the scrutiny, ensuring the court knew this case would not fade quietly. Jamal and Tiana's wedding, once a private celebration, had become a symbol of resistance, justice, and the fight against systemic racial prejudice. During the negotiations, the city's attorneys recognized the potential fallout if the case went to a full trial. The couple's legal team presented not only the emotional toll, but also the public relations disaster that could ensue from the officers' actions. Settlement discussions began in earnest, with amounts fluctuating and offers being weighed against the couple's principles. Jamal and Tiana faced a difficult decision: accept a settlement that acknowledged the harm done, or push for a trial that could drag on for months while exposing them to public scrutiny yet again. Tiana, ever composed, reminded Jamal that the goal was not revenge, but accountability. "This isn't just about us getting money," she said firmly. "It's about sending a message that racial harassment will have consequences." Jamal nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and tension. Every phone call, every document, every strategy session was a reminder of the gravity of the situation and the responsibility they now carried as both plaintiffs and symbols. The media continued to follow the story closely, amplifying each development and keeping public attention focused on the unfolding legal drama. Headlines detailed the couple's bravery, the officers' misconduct, and the mounting pressure on the city to resolve the matter fairly. Television interviews featured civil rights experts discussing the implications of the case for law enforcement practices nationwide. Jamal and Tiana were cautious but deliberate in their public statements, always emphasizing dignity, love, and the need for systemic change. The emotional toll was enormous: sleepless nights, anxious moments before every hearing, the constant replaying of humiliating memories. But it was tempered by the knowledge that their actions could pave the way for justice beyond their own experience. Their wedding day had been stolen from them, but the fight that followed gave that moment purpose beyond personal loss. Finally, after weeks of deliberation, mediation, and negotiation, the city offered a formal settlement, a substantial sum that acknowledged both the personal suffering of Jamal and Tiana and the wider implications of the officers' conduct. The offer was significant not only in monetary terms, but as a statement of accountability. Jamal and Tiana reviewed the agreement carefully, understanding that accepting it meant closure, recognition, and a tangible consequence for the officers' actions. They spoke with their lawyers, weighing the pros and cons, and ultimately agreed that this settlement represented a measure of justice that could never fully erase the trauma, but could ensure that the officers faced real consequences. When the agreement was signed, relief washed over them, mingled with lingering anger, but also a quiet pride. They had turned humiliation into empowerment, oppression into justice, and a private wedding nightmare into a story that inspired change. By the time the official announcement was made, the story had already gone viral. News outlets reported the $1.5 million settlement, framing it not just as a financial resolution, but as a statement against racial harassment and abuse of authority. Jamal and Tiana, once victims of discrimination on what should have been the happiest day of their lives, had become symbols of courage, resilience, and the power of collective action. Friends and family celebrated with tears, hugs, and quiet moments of reflection. The couple understood that no amount of money could replace the stolen moments of their wedding day, but the settlement represented recognition, justice, and a promise that their experience would not be forgotten. It was a moment of victory, hard-earned and fully deserved, marking the beginning of a long road toward healing, advocacy, and hope. In the weeks following the settlement, Jamal and Tiana slowly began to reclaim the sense of peace that had been shattered on their wedding day. Every time they walked past the venue where the incident had occurred, memories of humiliation still lingered: the echo of boots on marble, the cold glare of the officers, the shattering of petals and dreams. Yet, alongside those memories came a new awareness. They had faced injustice and emerged with dignity, their voices amplified by the courage of their friends, family, and supporters across the country. Tiana spent hours reflecting on the experience, journaling the raw emotions that had threatened to overwhelm her during the confrontation, and then feeling a sense of power in how their ordeal had become a catalyst for broader awareness. Jamal, too, carried a mixture of lingering anger and quiet pride, recognizing that surviving such a public act of racism required more than courage. It demanded patience, strategy, and an unwavering belief in justice. Together, they navigated a landscape of healing, understanding that while the emotional scars might never fully fade, their resilience and solidarity had made a lasting impact. The couple also realized the profound effect their story had on the wider community. Messages poured in from strangers, thanking them for standing firm and demonstrating that confronting racism, even in a deeply personal space like a wedding, could lead to accountability. Other Black couples reached out, sharing their own experiences of being harassed or doubted in spaces where they should have felt safe, and expressing gratitude that Jamal and Tiana had taken a public stand. Community leaders and civil rights organizations praised the couple, framing their courage as a model for advocacy and systemic change. For Jamal and Tiana, these messages were both humbling and affirming, a reminder that while the officers' actions had been intended to demean and intimidate, the response had transformed their personal trauma into collective awareness and empowerment. Despite the public attention, the couple also had to focus on their private healing. Therapy sessions, long conversations late into the night, and moments of quiet reflection became part of their routine. They discuss the moments of fear and anger in detail, unearthing the lingering tension from their wedding day, and slowly learning to separate the officers' cruelty from their love for one another. Tiana, in particular, found solace in reconnecting with family traditions that had always grounded her, using rituals and celebrations to reclaim the joy that had been nearly stolen from them. Jamal took comfort in community activism, volunteering for programs that supported victims of racial discrimination, transforming his anger into purposeful action. In these ways, the couple rebuilt not only their emotional foundation, but also their sense of agency, refusing to allow a single act of racism to define their lives. The wider public continued to respond with admiration and support. News outlets covered the couple's statements about resilience, highlighting their courage and framing the $1.5 million settlement as a symbol of accountability. Social media platforms buzzed with conversations about how everyday spaces could be made safer, how laws could protect against harassment, and how individuals could intervene when witnessing discrimination. Jamal and Tiana's story became a teaching moment, frequently cited in discussions about racial injustice, authority abuse, and civil rights in modern America. They were invited to speak at events, participate in panels, and consult with advocacy groups, all while maintaining a careful balance between public visibility and personal boundaries. Their voices, once nearly silenced by intimidation, now carried weight and influence far beyond what they had imagined on that wedding day. Even as their lives began to return to a semblance of normalcy, Jamal and Tiana never forgot the trauma of that day. Every anniversary, every glance at their wedding photos, and every retelling of the story reminded them of the fragility of joy in the face of systemic prejudice. Yet each memory was now infused with triumph, the knowledge that they had fought back, that they had been heard, and that their experience had sparked change. The couple found strength not only in their union, but in the solidarity of those who stood beside them, demonstrating that community and courage could confront injustice head-on. In that continued reflection, they discovered a deeper truth. While racism had tried to disrupt their celebration, it had inadvertently strengthened their resolve, widened their support network, and illuminated the path toward justice for countless others. By the end of paragraph 6, Jamal and Tiana had emerged not merely as victims or plaintiffs, but as symbols of resilience, advocacy, and hope, setting the stage for the final paragraph, which will tie together closure, reflection, and lasting impact, completing the 7-paragraph story. Months after the settlement, Jamal and Tiana finally felt a quiet sense of closure, though the memory of that day would always linger like a shadow in the corners of their minds. Their wedding, once marred by blatant racism and humiliation, had transformed into a story of courage, unity, and the power of standing up against injustice. They returned to the venue for a small, intimate celebration with their closest friends and family, reclaiming the space that had once been a site of fear and oppression. As they walked hand in hand through the familiar halls, they smiled with a sense of triumph, knowing that the officers' actions could no longer dictate their happiness or their narrative. The $1.5 million settlement, while unable to erase the trauma, served as a tangible acknowledgement of the wrong they had endured, a rare moment of accountability in a world where too often prejudice goes unchecked. Every guest who had stood with them that day, every person who had voiced support online, and every civil rights advocate who had championed their cause became part of a broader victory, proof that collective action could challenge injustice in meaningful ways. Jamal and Tiana reflected on how quickly a private moment of love and joy had been interrupted by hate, and yet how that very disruption had illuminated the strength and solidarity of their community. Their story became a beacon for others facing harassment and discrimination, a real-life example that courage and persistence could transform a personal violation into societal awareness and change. They realized that the incident had reshaped not only their own lives, but also the conversation around racial bias in public spaces, law enforcement accountability, and the importance of speaking up when witnessing injustice. It had been an unforgettable lesson in resilience, showing them that fear and intimidation could be confronted, challenged, and ultimately overcome. As they settled into married life, Jamal and Tiana committed themselves to using their experience to empower others. They spoke at community forums, shared their story in interviews, and collaborated with organizations advocating for civil rights, always emphasizing the importance of standing up, documenting abuse, and refusing to remain silent. Their journey highlighted that justice was not just about financial compensation, but about recognition, accountability, and the courage to reclaim dignity in spaces where it had been denied. Each step forward, each story shared, became a tribute to the resilience that had carried them through their darkest moments. Ultimately, the wedding that had begun with fear and humiliation ended as a symbol of hope and transformation. Jamal and Tiana's experience demonstrated that love, courage, and collective solidarity could confront prejudice directly and effectively. Their journey left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it, proving that even in the face of blatant racism, justice could be achieved, voices could be amplified, and hearts could heal. Theirs was a story that would resonate far beyond one venue, one wedding, and one moment, a story of resilience, empowerment, and the enduring truth that no act of hate could fully extinguish the light of justice.